Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining with us today. I'm your host, Bill Free, this week for the Awareness Podcast. And the normal title of my show is Living the Non-Dual Experience or Living the Non-Duality. And it's my joy and my pleasure to have a special guest, a good friend, Rupert Spira, today. Hi, Rupert.
Hello, Bill. Nice to be with you as always. And
Thank
hello
you.
to all your listeners as well.
Thank you, Rupert. We appreciate it. This is an exciting time for me because uh, Rupert and I began a conversation about 3 years ago, and it was we did a whole video at Garrison that ended up only having about 5 minutes of sound. And we lost the sound for that video and that sound bite. And I'm happy that we did because I have grown since that conversation with Rupert. And Rupert has, I don't know that he's grown, but he's definitely had a lot more students of A Course in Miracles in his retreats, and I think he'll probably answer a little differently than he did then some of the questions I'm going to ask him. And I just want to say that so we'll title this conversation "Letting Go of the Shore," and you'll know why I'm titling it that way in a few minutes. But the idea of this conversation comes from my life in search for what God is, or who God is, who Jesus is. And first it was 30 almost actually it was almost 25 years of Christianity, then probably 5 or 7 years of A Course in Miracles. And it was about 5 years before I met Rupert that awareness turned on for me, and all the way. Awareness just turned on, and I didn't really know how to put it into context. I didn't really know how to speak about what was happening. I would have conversations with looking at a spiritual book like A Course in Miracles or NTI, and I'd look at all these words and I'd go to myself, oh, why do we need all these words when you can just be awareness? And I didn't really understand what I was talking about until I met Rupert. And it was when I met you, Rupert, that you brought context and understanding to an experience that I had around 2010 that I didn't understand. And I had a real reluctance to let go of the shore. I had a real reluctance to let go of what the teaching that I was following then, A Course in Miracles, and you helped me to let go of the shore. And I'm hoping that this conversation that we're going to have is that this is really just, it's not going to be me talking. Mostly I'm just setting up the background of this, because I'm hoping that if you're listening to this conversation and you're a fundamentalist Course in Miracles, Buddhist, Christian, and other tradition, that something might come to your attention that would allow you to even temporarily let go of the shore, so that you could have a brand new experience. And Rupert, I'm reminded by the thing that you have talked about, where you spent your first part of your life, many years, as looking at Advaita, going to school for these teachings, and it was when you met, in a weird way, Robert Adams, but it was after many years of searching that you also let go of the shore and you found Francis Lucille. And I would like to ask you, how would, if you want to elaborate on any of the things that I mentioned, but how would you suggest someone that is in one of these other traditions might let go of the shore of their tradition temporarily so that they might have an understanding that brings them to the realization or the seeking to come to an end?
Bill, I think that the letting go of the shore, as you put it, if I understand you correctly, letting go of the shore, you mean letting go of the outer form of one's tradition. Is that correct? Including one's teacher, one's tradition, one's lineage, and so on. If I understand you correctly, the letting go of the shore is not a prerequisite for understanding. On the contrary, it's the understanding that is the prerequisite for letting go of the shore.
Mm.
In other words, one doesn't first let go of one's tradition, one's teacher, one's lineage, one's practices, and so on, and then come to the understanding. One comes to the understanding, and as a result of that, the forms in which one previously invested one's search for truth spontaneously fall away, and one no longer finds oneself attached to or identified with any particular teacher or teaching or tradition. Now, this doesn't mean to say that you necessarily stop practicing in that tradition. You may still carry on just simply because it's the tradition that you've inhabited for the last 10, 20, 30 years of your life. But you're not, your happiness, your peace, your understanding is no longer attached to, dependent on, or invested in that tradition or that teacher. So this letting go of the shore is something that just happens spontaneously as a result of understanding. And of course, I know, Bill, you understand, and I'm sure your listeners too. By understanding, I'm not referring to the intellectual understanding of the non-dual perspective. I'm referring to the lived and felt recognition of one's true nature. In fact, I would take a step further and say that the role of a tradition in general, and a so-called spiritual teacher in particular, is precisely to liberate the so-called student from that tradition or from that teacher. A teacher that holds on to their students, or that demands that their students still relate to them as a student, only does so because in some way their own identity is still invested in their role as a teacher. So the teacher has to not only liberate the so-called student from the limitation of identity associated with being a student, they also have to liberate themselves from the limitation of identity associated with being a teacher. In other words, a really good teacher has no students and therefore ceases to be a teacher.
Mm. Yeah. The idea that I love the way you just put that, because you really do need there needs to be a different. For me, there was a pull that something was missing from the equation, and it's almost like as a Course in Miracles student and as a seeker, as a Course in Miracles student, the course is built on almost like it's speaking to King Lear and trying to get King Lear to wake up. And I knew that there was more to it than that
Okay.
because,
Bill, I'm just going to interrupt you briefly there for the sake of your listeners. Not all of them know what you mean by King Lear. Bill, you're referring to an analogy I use where an actor called John Smith plays the part of King Lear. John Smith represents uh, the presence of awareness or infinite being, and King Lear is a temporary limitation of John Smith. In other words, King Lear represents the separate self. So I think you're suggesting a time in which you felt that you, as a separate person, were going to become enlightened or gain understanding. Well, that was just some context to
yeah,
your mention of
well,
King Lear.
that's what most of us think
Yes,
when we first get on this path, and even in common conversation, we, is he awake? Is she awake? Am I awake? And who is it that's awake? It's not Bill.
yes, yes. These teachings are, well, there are two possibilities. They're either misunderstandings or they are compassionate concessions to the separate self that most people believe and feel themselves to be. In other words, when a person who is suffering approaches a teacher or a teaching, the, the teaching may provisionally, um, as a concession to the separate self or the apparently separate self, the teaching or teacher may give that person something to do, a practice. Now, you could argue that giving the separate self something to do was to credit it with an existence of its own, and therefore giving it a practice to do would simply perpetuate its existence. John Smith assumes the form of King Lear and he's miserable. You might suggest that anything King Lear does as King Lear is only going to perpetuate his belief in himself as King Lear, and therefore is only going to ultimately substantiate his misery. And some teachings do take this approach and refuse to give the person anything to do. And that's a valid approach. Other teachings make a concession to the separate self and recommend the highest teaching for the separate self, namely, investigate who you really are. And then some teachings, again, less radical, less direct, give the separate self something to do, like focusing on a mantra or focusing on the breath or something like that. But all of these teachings, even the teachings that refuse to give the separate self something to do, simply by virtue of the fact that these teachers are teaching, are speaking, are writing, they are making a concession to the separate self. Even if they say, there's nobody here, there's nothing to do. If there's really nothing to do, why are you giving talks and writing books? So all teachings, however radical they may seem to be, however direct or indirect they seem to be, they all make a concession to the seeking self. After all, awareness doesn't need any teaching, or in religious language, God's infinite being doesn't need any teaching or any spiritual practice. So all the teachings, the radical ones, the direct ones, the less radical ones, the progressive ones, they all make a concession and they are all legitimate as such.
Yeah, it's connecting with that, is important because it is important that we allow the teaching to occur, to take place, and yet there's something that's occurring where the individual isn't really in charge, although they think they are. I think that it's me doing what I do, or looking for finding Rupert Spira, or finding Francis, or whatever's next. I think I'm making decisions, and I'm finding more and more that decisions are being made, that things are happening, and I'm sort of just watching it all.
Yes, yes, yes. The real, as you say, decisions are being made. The interesting question is, on whose behalf are they being made? Who, who is being represented by the decisions we make? Are they arising on behalf of a temporary, finite, separate self? Or are the decisions being made on behalf of the qualities, if we can call them qualities, that are inherent in our true nature, or the nature of reality? In other words, is the activity of our minds, our thoughts, our feelings, our decisions, our choices, and so on, do they arise in service of the separate self, or do they arise in service of the whole reality, God's being?
Well, either way, it doesn't matter because it's happening. And the important piece is not to judge the experience.
Well, you could say it doesn't matter, Bill. You're right from an absolute point of view. It doesn't matter. However, if our decisions, our choices, our thoughts, our actions are initiated or rise on behalf of the felt sense of separation that characterizes the ego or the separate self, then those decisions and choices will lead to actions that bring sorrow and conflict into the world. You could say ultimately that doesn't matter. It's true. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. But at a more relative level, I think it does matter.
Hmm.
If someone that you love is being hurt physically, emotionally, psychologically, I don't think you honestly feel it doesn't matter. I don't think anybody honestly feels it doesn't matter. No, we think it matters.
Yeah.
Ultimately, reality cannot be hurt, cannot be destroyed. I understand. We all understand this, but we shouldn't conclude from this that at a relative level that it doesn't matter the quality of our thoughts and feelings and our subsequent actions and relationships. I, for one, feel that it does matter.
Well, and you're right. On a relative level, it matters very much. It matters for me. It's values of integrity and honesty,
Yeah,
and doing and being kind and generous,
yes,
gentle. All those things.
yes.
On a subtle level is really what I was speaking to, because on a subtle level, when the understanding starts to take hold, starts to be the primary experience of one's awakening experience, there's a the activities of the body mind will occur, and that's seen. And when it's not judged or touched, then it sort of gets absorbed into, I would think, as consciousness or awareness. It just sort of that body, that personal self identity is it sort of softened and moved into, okay, so maybe that won't happen. Maybe thoughts and experiences of the body mind are happening now, but if they're not touched or judged, they sort of drift away into nothingness. Yes? Does that make sense?
Yes. So I'm just hesitating because and I know you're not saying this, Bill. I understand that this is not what you're saying, but I want to make sure that what you're saying is not misunderstood by your listeners. That if a thought and a feeling arises from the sense of separation, and that separation leads to actions in the world that are cruel or unkind or unjust, I don't think it's enough just to stand back and say, well, I'm watching it all from the witnessing presence of awareness. It's not really me. It's just, it's okay. I'm just watching it. Because if we really knew ourselves, if we were established in and as the witnessing presence of awareness, I'm not sure these thoughts and feelings would be arising in the first place.
Agreed.
So I think all I'm cautioning against, Bill, and as I say again, I know this is not the case with you. I'm just cautioning against justifying egoic behavior by washing a veneer of the non-dual understanding over it. Everything just happens in awareness. Everything is known by awareness. There's nobody here. I'm continuing to think and feel in unkind, unjust ways. My actions betray my feelings and thoughts, and yet there's nobody here. I'm just watching it all. I think we have to be very careful that we all know of numerous examples of people, teachers especially, I should say, whose, at least as far as we can see, of course we cannot know, but at least as far as we can see, whose behavior does not always represent the non-dual action, the non-dual understanding. In other words, behavior that is not always an expression of truth, love, peace, joy, and yet who justify their behavior with saying, "Oh, it's good for your ego that I behaved in this way. I'm just exposing the ego in you and giving you an opportunity to transcend it." We all know, so we just have to be careful, Bill.
Yeah. Oh my God. I mean, I am definitely not suggesting that. So,
I know you're not, Bill. I know you're not. I'm just being cautious not to make generalizations. And then when those generalizations are taken out of context, they lead to misunderstandings, and we all know examples of these misunderstandings.
right, right. So let's go back to the idea of being a fundamentalist something. In any of those, and a fundamentalist, I would say, just obsessed with a dogma, obsessed with a teaching, and unable to see past it because they've identified so fully with the teaching that that's who they are. And how does one begin to relax from that so that they can be more open to the direct experience, to the understanding of the inward facing path, and then of course add to that the outward facing path. How would someone begin that um, access?
Fundamentalism of any sort always indicates a strong ego, because fundamentalism is a very strong attachment to a particular idea or person, whether that idea or person is of a religious nature, a political nature, that's not important. It's fundamentalism implies a kind of rigid attachment. There's always rigidity in fundamentalism. And what is important in fundamentalism is not who or what the person is invested in. It is the ego that is invested in it. In fact, it is the strength of the ego. Fundamentalism is an indication of the strength of the ego, which needs to be so rigidly attached to a particular person, tradition, teaching in this case. So fundamentalism is a particularly strong, rigid attachment and always betrays a particularly strong, rigid ego. What is ironic, of course, is when one is fundamentally attached to a person, a teaching, or a tradition whose purpose is ego transcendence. I mean, imagine, for instance, being a Ramana Maharshi fundamentalist. What was Ramana Maharshi's main message? It was the nature of our essential self or being was inherently free, at peace, fulfilled, that it did not need anyone or anything to invest itself in. So to be attached to Ramana Maharshi is a contradiction of terms. The whole premise of Ramana Maharshi's teaching was that what we essentially are is free, autonomous, unattached, at peace, lacking nothing, needing nothing, not dependent upon anyone. How could a student of this teaching become dependent on Ramana Maharshi? When he was dying, many of his students were crying, and he didn't understand this. He said, "Why are you crying?" He said, I'm paraphrasing now. "All my life I've been telling you that who I really am is your very own being. And you're crying because my body is dying. Have you not understood? I cannot die. I do not die. I am yourself. I am your being." So to be really devoted to Ramana Maharshi means to be devoted to being, to your being, which is God's being. It has nothing to do with being devoted to a person, a place in India, a particular formulation of the non-dual understanding. So to be a fundamentalist supporter of Ramana Maharshi, a rigid supporter of Ramana Maharshi, someone who is not able to tolerate any other formulation or any other teacher or any other teaching, is really a complete violation of what Ramana Maharshi stood for. So to answer your question, Bill, it's very difficult. What does a fundamentalist supporter of a tradition, a teaching, a teacher do? Because it's difficult precisely because a fundamentalist has a particularly strong ego. And in the religious and spiritual realm, their ego is usually they don't notice the strength of their own ego. They're so devoted to the teacher, the teaching, the tradition, the lineage, and the practice, and so on, that they're completely unaware that there is this rigidity in their heart. So it's difficult. It requires such a deep love of truth. That's really what it comes down to. It requires such a deep love of truth that one is willing to turn round and realize, I have invested my ego in a teacher or a tradition. Why? Because my ego needs something to hold on to. would it be possible to let go, not to let go of one's love of the truth, but would it be possible to let go of one's teacher, one's tradition, one's teaching, one's lineage, one's practices, and so on? But and usually for a fundamentalist, the prospect of letting go of the person or the teaching in whom or in which one has invested one's identity is terrifying. Who would the fundamentalist Ramana Maharshi devotee be if they were to let go of Ramana Maharshi? That would be ego death. That would be terrifying. But that's what Ramana Maharshi wanted them to do. That's
Mm-hmm.
what he was. That's true surrender. Meister Eckhart, he's had this beautiful prayer, and I'm paraphrasing now, because in a way, even higher than our devotion to someone like Ramana Maharshi. Don't get me wrong. I think you understand, Bill. I hold Ramana Maharshi in the highest possible esteem.
Oh yeah.
And he has been a luminary, a guide all my adult life. So I hope nothing I'm saying contradicts that. But even higher than one's devotion to a teacher such as Ramana Maharshi is one's devotion to God. And Meister Eckhart had this beautiful prayer. He said, God, I pray to you to rid me of God. And that is humility.
Mm.
That is true love of God. So, so, so humble, such a deep love of God that Meister Eckhart prayed to God that he even be relieved of all notion of what God is, because he realized that his idea of God was something that his ego was invested in, and therefore was a limitation on his being. So he prayed to God to rid him of God. That's so beautiful. That's real devotion.
So in that character and that transmission, it it looks and feels as if somehow the heart opens and love reveals itself as itself. It somehow the heart opens to um, to have that as as its as its overriding uh, highest longing.
Yes, as the heart is gradually, in most cases, relieved of all its limitations. That is, the limitations that it acquires from the content of experience. The heart, so to speak, expands. It loses its limitations. The human being is revealed as God's being. The finite being is revealed as infinite being. And that is love. Love is the taste of infinite being. That is the taste of the being that is shared by everyone. That's what love is, the taste of our shared being, the taste of the fact that the reality, the being of everyone and everything is the same being. In other words, in the ultimate analysis, there are no people or things or objects. There are no discrete, independently existing selves or objects. There is one being appearing as 10,000 things, 10,000 selves, but never ceasing to be itself. And that is the experience of love, this recognition. It's the experience of non-duality, not two, not many, one. And yes, so as our heart or our being is lets go of its limitations, at some point it stands revealed as infinite being, God's being, whose nature is love. That is, when I say whose nature is love, I mean that knows nothing other than itself, that knows no otherness. Remember Balayani, otherness for him is him without otherness.
Hmm. So,
Rumi, sorry.
well, I was going to say that you talked about Ramana being a fundamentalist Ramana Maharshi devotee, and I was a fundamentalist uh, Christian, and I was a fundamentalist course student. And as a fundamentalist course student, it's the same thing. There's a attachment to the teaching, and in this way, the teacher is supposedly Jesus, the author of A Course in Miracles, through the mind of the scribe Helen Schuckman. But there's an attachment to that identity of the world's identity of Jesus being like super pope, and that there's a strong attachment there, especially when the
Yeah.
voice is coming through this transmission called Jesus.
I think, but it's still possible. It's called the Ishtadeva in the Vedantic tradition, our chosen deity, the chosen form of the deity. And I don't mean to suggest that one would necessarily lose this. One may still have a deep connection in one's heart with Jesus or the Buddha or Ramana Maharshi. I'm not suggesting that that at a personal level there may not still be this deep connection with a person. I'm not denying the validity of that. It's just the rigid investment of one's identity in that person that I'm calling into question. I, I, I'm speaking really, what I'm saying is coming from my experience. It's more in my work as an artist. I felt it particularly, or perhaps most strongly. As you know, I did an apprenticeship with a well-known artist, potter called Michael Cardew. I spent the last 2 years of his life with him. And for some years after, well, during my time with him, but for some years after my time with him, I I was I was had some fundamentalist attachment, not just to him. He had died. He died shortly after I left. But in the early years of working in my own studio, I had some attachment to his ideas, to his methods, to his processes, to his idea of beauty. And it took me some time to recognize that there was some fear in my attachment. From the out, there was some rigidity in it. It wasn't open. It wasn't open to other possibilities. And when I looked inside myself and asked, um, why why the strength of this attachment to a particular ideal, I felt I could feel the extent to which I had invested my identity. My identity was derived to a degree from association with this person, this ideal. And I could feel the fear in me of letting go of this attachment because it felt like a kind of ego death. Now, in time, I did let go of it. I didn't let go of any of my love or respect for Michael Cardew or for um, the ideals that he represented. But I let go of the investment of my identity in them. There was a sort of softening in me. And this made me more open to other influences, other formulations, so that was that was an example from my own life early on. This is in my 20s, really, of how this kind of fundamentalism can look virtuous from the outside, but can be masking the fear that is characteristic of the ego.
It felt when you were describing that, it sounded and it felt like you had a pause and a self inquiry. You sort of investigated the feelings
Yes,
and the
it's
ideas.
true. That's true, Bill. At that stage, this process of self-investigation or inquiry, it hadn't really formulated itself in my mind as explicitly and clearly as it does now. So it took some time. It was more in the realm of feelings than rational investigation. It
Yeah,
took
of course.
later for this investigation to really become clearly formulated in my mind. But yes, it was a kind of um, investigation, a deep investigation into the nature of myself or my identity, but at a feeling level, not just at a rational intellectual level.
Yeah, yeah.
Bill, while you were saying that, a thought came to me. Just I want to link. I want to say this really for the Buddhists present, and I'm sure you have lots of Buddhist listeners. That beautiful prayer I quoted of Meister Eckhart's, "God, I pray that you relieve me of God." That the Buddhism, they have a similar understanding when they say, "If you meet the Buddha on the path, kill him." It's the same understanding. It's a beautiful recognition in Buddhism.
Ah,
If you meet the Buddha on the path, if because the Buddha really means the light of awareness, the awakened awareness.
yeah,
But if you project the awakened awareness onto a person and you invest your identity not in the presence of awareness but in a person, you have to kill that person. They don't mean it literally, of course. You have to go beyond. You have to remove that person. You have to so that your being is invested in your being. Your being is invested in itself, not
yeah,
in the Buddha, however noble the person might be. You don't cease loving the person. You just cease investing your identity in them. So
yeah,
I just say that to show that there is this understanding. You find it in all the traditions.
yeah, yeah. Even the Christian tradition is, I don't think the Apostle Paul, understood what he was saying when he said that you need to crucify yourself as Christ crucified himself. Similar, as an example, you need to crucify yourself as the carnal behavior that you're having. He meant the same thing, that you need to die of self. It was a similar meaning
Yes,
in that Christian tradition. And I like that example where if you meet the Buddha on the path, you need to kill him. That's a great metaphor example. I met someone at one of your retreats that had been a Buddhist for 7 years in a monastery, and this person said that they just came to this understanding recently through the direct path teaching. So you can get lost in these traditions for a long time.
yes, that's very true. But as someone who spent 20 years not in a monastery, but in a tradition, my original the school in London at College House, which was a school of classical Advaita Vedanta under the um, the, the guidance of Shantananda Saraswati, the then Shankaracharya of the north of India. The, I kind of grew up, so to speak, spiritually in that school, in that environment, and it's true that in my mid-30s, I moved away from it. It was too restrictive. It was too limiting. I never rejected it. I always had and have the greatest love and respect for the Shankaracharya's teaching. But I did begin to feel that it was a limitation. However, so in some ways, you could say I rejected it. I didn't reject, I just moved away. But it served me very well for 20 years. So I wouldn't look back on it and criticize it or say that it was not valid for me to spend those 20 years. Perhaps it was a little too long, but so someone who has spent 7 years in a Buddhist monastery or in a Zen community or in a Sufi school, that has its place.
Hmm.
They are very often, these communities provide the kind of sort of protective environment, the protective, nurturing environment, where in the early stages of our investigation or path, we need this protection, this seclusion in a way. It's like when you plant a young tree, you put some stakes around it, and then you put a wire fencing around the stakes to protect the tree from the rabbits or the deer who will gnaw away at its trunk and kill it before it takes off. But then 3 years later, the tree is strong, and you take the fence around it away. It no longer needs that protection, but it needed it to begin with. So
Hmm.
there's a place for these communities. Again, I'm just saying this so that whilst we identify the danger of fundamentalism, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That we're also respecting the value of being part of a community such as the one that you mentioned, or the one that I spent many years in, without investing one's identity in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that
Well,
is largely, sorry, Bill, can I just add one thing to that?
yeah.
That is largely to do with the skill, and not just the skill, the depth of understanding of the teacher or the person that is in charge of the community or the organization. If they are truly free and they do not need their students' devotion or adulation or respect or even their attention, then they have no vested interest in the student. Their job as a teacher is to help the student to cease being a student as quickly as possible. But in order to do that, the so-called teacher has themselves to be completely unattached to their role as a teacher. They must need nothing from their students, not their respect, not their adulation. And that is a test for a teacher.
Hmm. Yeah.
Many teachers, they no, it's a test. Is the teacher really free, or is there something in them that still needs the adulation, the respect, the devotion of their students? Well, if there is that right there, that is the ego. And I don't say this with any, I'm not judging this, I'm just stating it as a fact. If there is something that the student by definition is invested in the teacher, that's natural. Whenever we approach a teacher as a student, there is inevitably some investment of our identity in the teacher. It is the teacher's job, first of all, to be free of any such investment in the student themselves, and then to help the student as quickly as possible to withdraw their projection from the teacher and to be free, not to need the teacher.
Hmm.
A good teacher should liberate their students from the need for a teacher. So a teacher that holds on to a student or makes the student in some way dependent upon them, one has to ask why.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that it was in 2018 that I was at a Garrison retreat, and it was a Monday, and you shared a morning meditation that for the first time in my spiritual unfolding, we came out of when we were coming out of that meditation, there was an invitation to include all of the physical the things that are seen without just as a part of the continued meditation to include all of the parts of the room and the visual perceptions and things to include them in the experience of awareness. And that became a new experience for me to take from something that I knew as I am, as presence, as a felt and known experience of beingness, and then include all of physical manifestations. That was brand new for me, and I just want to. What I did after that experience, I went back. I came back to Maine, where I live, with my wife Lisa, and I started reinterpreting all of the workbook lessons, 365 workbook lessons. I started rereading all of them and seeing them in a whole fresh, brand new way that was complementary to each one and able to disseminate and experience the essence of the lessons brand new. And then I brought that back to my community, to A Course in Miracles community, bringing the understanding into back into the progressive path experience. It was beautiful. I want to thank you for that
Bill,
opening
I
for me.
understand exactly what you're referring to. I was brought up in the Christian tradition and then moved away from it into my exploration of Vedanta and Sufism and Kashmir Shaivism. But now, when I go back to the early the Christian literature that I grew up with, or when I read the mystical Christians now, it it just melts my heart. It's all there. It's coded. Well, like all teachings, all traditions are coded. But so it at the time I had to move away from it, explore the same understanding in other traditions. But when I then came back to it, when I come back to it now, and I read Meister Eckhart now, or um, it's so, or some of the early mystical Christians, it's so pregnant with understanding, so full of perfume, and so yes, I understand, and at the time I couldn't understand it, so I had to move away from it and then come back to it. So I understand exactly what you're referring to. It's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I only say that as we come to a closing in this broadcast and this these ideas because I like to say to people that the idea of letting go of the shore is only a temporary experience because you come back to the shore and you include everything that was all about the shore, but you come back with a whole new understanding and a sharing with everything on the shore. Beautiful. Well, Rupert, we've come to the end of our time together for this broadcast, and thank you for sharing your insights and your love for truth and your own direct experiences as your unfolding awakening occurs. And look forward to being with you again. I just want to mention for you all that are listening or watching that Rupert has a retreat coming up in October. I think it's I had it saved here. It was October 9th to the 16th at the Garrison Institute. And then he has a one, and then that's on the East Coast. He goes back over to the West Coast and he has a 7-day retreat at Mercy Center in October 23rd to the 30th. So you're hearing this in October. You can register for one of those events, and you can have the experiences that I've had many times with Rupert. He's not a teacher, but you're going to enjoy what you. But he kind of teaches a little bit. So Rupert, thank you for being here. All the best to you and Ellen, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bill. Pleasure, as always, to be with you and speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining with us today.